Nice to see everybody. I'm really delighted to introduce Menna. Dr. Menna Agha is an architect and researcher who has recently been coordinating the spatial justice agenda at the Flanders Architecture Institute in Belgium. She joins the Azrieli School to promote pedagogy and research in the newly established area of design and spatial justice. She is cross-appointed at the Carleton University Institute for African Studies. Menna holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Antwerp and a Master of Arts in Gender Design from Cologne International School of Design. In 2019-2020, she was the Spatial Justice Fellow and Visiting Assistant Professor at the University of Oregon. She is a third-generation displaced Fadicha Nubian, a legacy that infuses her research interests in race, gender, space, and territory. Among her publications are Nubia Still Exists, The Utility of the Nostalgic Space, The Non-Work of the Unimportant, The Shadow Economy of Nubian Women in Displaced Villages, and Liminal Publics, Marginal Resistance. Thanks so much for being here, Menna. Over to you.
Thank you so much for this kind welcome and for this kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Hello to those of you who were there this afternoon and to the beautiful new faces. I want to reiterate and start by thanking this land for taking care of us, even though we bring harm way too often, and acknowledge that we are on stolen land, and wish a happy Ramadan and a Ramadan Kareem to all my fellow Muslims here who are a bit hungry. I'm traveling, so I got to eat today. So, remember that as we stand here, there is a genocide happening in Gaza. As we speak, people are starving, and murders and genocide is happening to our brothers and sisters there. So before we go into this emotional exercise, I wanted to bring these emotional statements to the table and let them sit for a bit. And I encourage you to feel them. The exercise today is an emotional one. So this is a part of my research and my ongoing political project, trying to figure out what kind of architect I want to be and what kind of architecture I want to practice or work for me. And this is because of generally the practice as it is, architecture in its canon, has not really worked for us, has not worked for my people in its manifestation, in its tradition of practice, has been always on the side of either colonizing or displacing my people. So the questions that I'm asking today are simply, what kind of architecture, what kind of architect, and why now? And before we go into the questions of what kind of architecture and what kind of architect, let me start with why now? Because it doesn't seem to be working. We are very aware of the level, the stark level of injustice that we are facing and we live through every day in the built environment, from unattainable housing to unwalkable cities to inaccessible countries and lands due to the project of the nation state and the passport racism. So there are all these spatial issues that we can clearly see, and with that comes the work of my, let's call it, title, and the movement within architecture in the past few years, looking at spatial justice, right? So why now? Because it's not working. It doesn't seem to be working, and for us, racialized people, Black people, indigenous people, people of global majority, it has not been working. Architecture and architecture education have been canonized, have been Western-centric for the past how many years, and our curricula have been a witness to it. And maybe I'm a bit older than you, but I studied on the African continent, and my entire curriculum was studying Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. Why? What did they do for me? What did they do for my grandmother, right? And mentioning my grandmother, let me tell you a little bit about where I come from. I come from this area between Egypt and Sudan that got sliced by the border of the nation state, just like indigenous people around the world. Lands that get sliced and cousins end up in two different countries with two different passports. So I'm Egyptian Nubian, my cousin, my direct blood cousin, is Sudanese Nubian. My land has been under displacement due to colonial and after that capitalist and neoliberal projects for the past 100 years. In 1902, the British colonizer decided that they needed more water to make sure their cotton crops are protected. You know, cotton was this crop of blood across the world. If you were in South America, if you were a descendant of enslaved African Americans, if you are African or if you are from the subcontinent, you probably have stories of cotton colonialism. So to secure their cotton agriculture in the north, they built the Aswan Low Dam. And to build the Aswan Low Dam in the north of my land, and our river runs south to north. Well, your south to north. Ours is flipped. So it runs from Lower Egypt to, it runs from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt. The African map is flipped. It started to raise the water level and submerge our agricultural land. So that's in 1902. 1912, they decided they need to control the water even more, and then they heightened that dam to a higher level, 12 meter higher of a level, and submerged even more agricultural land and some houses. So Nubians, my people, do not get a notice. Nobody tells them the water is going to raise. When the winter comes, well, our winter is not really cold. Our winter is like probably hotter than your summer a little bit. But we know it's winter because the water level rises. When the water level rises and finds a dam in front of it, it submerges everything around it. So we kept losing land. In 1933, they did a significantly more detrimental heightening of the dam that destroyed 24,000 houses, Nubian houses. And Nubians still came together in community solidarity. And in 1 year, according to the accounts of the Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi, in 12 months, they rebuilt the entirety of that housing stock. And according to Hassan Fathi, not one house looked like the other. So communities coming together to build against that form of displacement and environmental racism. In 1964, the post-colonial government of Egypt, led by Abdel Nasser, who was the second post-colonial president of Egypt, decided that he needed a pyramid of his own. He decided he needed a new notion of modernism and a new symbol of the nation state, and built the Aswan High Dam. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this, but at that time, it produced the biggest artificial lake in the world, barring Lake Volta that came after and was a bit bigger, which is in Ghana. So before our Ghanaian brothers and sisters, our land was submerged. My ancestral land was submerged under one of the biggest artificial bodies of water in the world, so that the post-colonial country of Egypt can join modernism and can have electricity. During all these times, the community comes together and rebuilds. So with every layer of injustice, displacement, and disposition, collective emotional performances, collective solidarity is what sustained my community. So while I study about all the architects, what the reason I'm alive and well and sustained is actually my community's work of solidarity. And the work of solidarity here is something that I want to be very clear about before we go in. If I work, that's labor. If you work, that's labor. If we work together, that's a third added value of labor, which is now, by the way, is being extracted by the data suction machine that we live on, because we do our collective labor, but they don't tell us that it's collective labor. We work for them for free. They take our data and they build stories out of it. But actually, me working is labor, you working is labor. Me and you working is not 1 + 1 = 2, it's actually 1 + 1 = 3, and sometimes it's 1 + 1 = 8. It depends on how connected to it all of us are. And I wanted to introduce you to this, to take you to the 1970s, when, again, after more displacement, after the high dam of my people, the community comes together and rebuilds, right? And my research, my doctoral research focused on that time, between 1964 and 1985, the time between the between the displacement of Nubians and a little bit of the 20 years following the displacement and resettlement of Nubians, which was a period very active in building. And through this process, I asked, so what is building? Okay, what does it mean to build? This woman right there, and I mentioned her name, Agha Tahra, and honor her, in the 1970s decided that she wants to go back to our ancestral land. She went in there, built a house with around 70 other Nubians. And then when the circumstances became so dire, everybody left and she stayed. And because of her, because she was alone in the desert, she became a pilgrimage and she held our land. By her body, just staying across the river, 300 kilometers away from our land, our place of displacement, this woman, just by her body, held land. See that emotional production of space? So spaces are produced emotionally. This space is sustained because this woman sits there with all her love and belonging and maintaining the memory of that space. We lost her to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2022, and it was a huge loss. So just like many of our indigenous brothers and sisters, the loss of our elders is a huge loss in cultural capital. For us, with that, we lost a lot of language expertise, and we also lost a lot of resistance. As with Agha Tahra, we lost a symbol. However, her house state remains there as a reminder that our land still exists. Her body still is she still is embodied in her house. Her house becomes an extension of her flesh. Agha Tahra was one of my foremothers who have been producing space through employing their emotional work, right? And then sustaining that space emotionally. We are sustained. We want to go back to our ancestral land. We still remember our ancestral land. We still claim our ancestral land, and we still claim a land back project, because that emotional work, that nostalgic emotional work, refuses to cede space to what people sometimes consider as a realism. Other forms of emotional production of space is this case in our street of my grand aunt, who's now our family's matriarch, Zulaykha Sakina. Anna Zulaykha, or Anna is like the kind of the cutesy way to say grandma in Nubian. Anna Zulaykha lives in a house around there, and in the displacement village of Kustul. This displacement village is designed around Abdel Nasser's dream of green factories. So Nubians are going to be displaced. Their land is going to be submerged. They're going to go into this new settlement. They're going to be these small villages in this huge agricultural land, and they're going to produce crops for Egypt. So those people are going to become Egypt's new breadbasket, this land. Of course, all that dream fell because the salination levels of this land, our land of displacement, was off the charts. It did not allow for any viable agriculture except for a few crops. So now we all rely on sugarcane in that area, and his dream of actually producing bread out of it is not really viable. However, still, the planning of this kind of architecture was all about that industry, that agro-industry. And these streets are designed within the village are designed for these big trucks to cross with their crops into the main asphalt road and transfer these crops all to the factories and to be sold. However, these Nubian women turn their streets, and not just my grandma, these Nubian women turn these streets into outdoor living rooms. Again, another emotional production of space. And they turn it into through their wanting to come together, through them wanting to create kinship as neighbors. They're not related to each other, but creating these families of choice and having meals with each other every day. The cars or the trucks would come in at the edge of the road, see the elderly women, and then go all the way around the village, because there is no person in their right mind that dares to drive and kind of bring dust near elder Nubian women. That's not going to happen. So with them being there, they have changed the land use map of that village. These roads are no longer owned by agro-industry. These roads are now owned by, and they're no longer roads. These are outdoor living areas, and these are owned by the community, right? And then I was doing that kind of research in my home village, and I was thinking, what space is not produced emotionally? What space, even the most evil of spaces are produced emotionally. Every single space is produced through a certain kind of an emotional intent, right? But then the question was, well, how can these, how are these emotional intents managed in this process? So there is always an emotional purpose behind something we're doing. Every time we make space, every time we move a chair from one side to another, there is an emotional intent behind it. But now I was worried about diluting all this, because if we say, oh, everything is emotional, then what is the kind of work that we can grasp and understand so that we are able to do that work as well? Because we produce all these spaces emotionally, but whose emotion? How are we aware of it? How are we situating ourselves in choosing what to do or in deciding what to do? Especially because all of us as architects, unless 2 or 3 of you hopefully end up being at the top of the profession, we all are going to be working in a field following somebody else's will, right? Somebody's going to design, we're going to be commissioned, and you're going to have to produce 16 files of HVAC revisions or like doors. You're going to be just working on doors and following somebody else's intent, right? You don't know where these doors are. It can be in a Saudi prison. You have no idea. So it's this this disconnect in our labor and this, I think, dispossession of our emotional position in the production of architecture, and that is turning us into just extracted labor. So as architects, I argue, for us as architects, it is our responsibility to define that emotional position and not abdicate our responsibility from it. How do we feel about our spaces? What worlds do we want to make? And how do we want to make them? The other point for me, and this I would find within literature, is that the emotional is quintessentially African. African and Black literature situates the idea of the emotional in parallel to the European idea of of reason, of the rational. So Leopold Senghor, who was the renowned poet, a member of the incredible scholars of the Negritude, but also the first post-colonial president of Senegal, has this very important quote in which he says, "The emotional to African is like the reason to the Hellenic." So what is reason within Western epistemologies? Reason is the vehicle through which meaning is made, right? It's the vehicle through which people make sense of things, that reason. And for us as African, it's actually the emotional. The emotional is pronounced, is understood, is named, and it's in its complexity becomes the vehicle through which we understand our world and make sense of it and make decisions around that world if we are allowed to, because through colonial projects come with projects of epistemocide, which means canceling everything else. It's just one world, and everything else has to be erased. And as Africans, we try to decolonize ourselves and go back into that position of understanding the world through the emotional. So let me tell you a story about trying to understand how building works within our village. So I go to my great aunt and tell her, oh, who was building, what happened around the history of the multi, when was it built? And she said, oh, you don't know? Your grandmother built that. And I thought, so here, the feminist architect, Europe trained, in me is like, oh, Rose is a riveter, my grandmother holding, all the stones and, stacking masonry and thatching, and Nubian women did all that. Nubian women were co-builders in the physical term. However, building does not mean that at all. So when she said, your grandmother built that, I traced that story just to remember to figure out or to discover that my grandmother did not touch a piece of material. She sat on a deck, on a bench, made tea, and fed everybody. And while she sits there, she would say, no, don't make the window there. No, don't do that. You know what? We're not going to do that wall. That wall is not going to happen. And why did that happen? This woman had raised the funding for this community project, this house that was shared by the Nubian community. After displacement to the community, the state gave us these tiny houses that did not really incubate our culture. So Nubians generated this new typology to hold our political and social life. And that typology was built by my grandmother and women like her across Nubian villages. So she would be the one who's mobilizing the trust she earns with her community to raise funds. So people are going to give her money with the utmost trust. Then the youth in the community are going to go to her because they know she is one of their collective mothers. She's going to take care of them and they're going to work for her. She's not paying anybody, she's just feeding them. And she would feed them anyways. And then with that respect, because everybody knows that she's working for the community, she gets to make these decisions and everybody's listening to her. So then, is she an architect? Is she a builder? Across history, we understand the architect in different kind of formats and definitions. In the past, the architect was the person who has the technique, right? The person who can get the structure to stand and be stable. In other points of history, the architect was the one who can draw, right? In the kind of Vitruvian tradition and the Beaux-Arts tradition, an architect is only an architect if they can draw. And there is all this evidence from India, for example, by the British discounting the entire architecture and building tradition and refusing to deem anybody an architect unless they can build in the Beaux-Arts style. They can draw in the Beaux-Arts style, which means you're not an architect unless you know how to draw plan sections and elevations. This is the definition. Otherwise, you're stripped from that idea. So it seems like the word architect is used to control this field and define it. So maybe it's time now to renegotiate it. Who is an architect? Is she an architect? So if people who were able to trade their physical labor or their expertise were called architects, and now an architect is an intellectual worker, right? All these architects make like sketches and stuff, and everybody around them is doing all the work on their behalf. They are just an intellectual worker, and we recognize them for being an architect just by their intellectual contribution. So can we recognize architects by their emotional contribution? And not just emotional contribution as an immature emotion. We're speaking about a systemic, long-term emotional investment in community and kinship making that led to an actual material added value. So this woman created added value out of thin air, out of the most dire times in Nubian history. She still got a piece of architecture, a piece of real estate, existing on the other side of her efforts. So, and in the process, made decisions about an invention of a whole new typology and decisions on that design. Can we consider her an architect? I would. I don't need that validation from anybody. I would, and I also would like to be that kind of architect. This is the practice that works for me. You know why? Because historically, this kind of practice was the only practice that had any salvage for people like myself. Modernism had never promised us justice. It only promised us access. And modernism came in with access for those who were deemed deserving. For the rest of us, the discounted humanities and the displaceable, the racialized modernity did not really come with access, it came with extraction. And if you are doubting this, I remind you with what is happening now in the Congo. And I remind you that you're holding an evidence of that in your phones that are in your hands right now. So, this is a render from memory from, I think I was probably 7 at that time. My grandmother renovated our house. These houses, the land that the state had given us it was not really proper for building, so all our houses crack across the years and we have to rebuild. So Nubian displacement villages are always in a position of building and rebuilding. So a lot of our income and a lot of our capital just goes into building. And in that process, there were 2 hired helping builders and 2 of my cousins. And then the women were making, so I remember my aunt was making them lunch at that time. And all she did was sit there, make tea. Everybody would call her an affectionate name like mom or auntie. And then she's stopping people from working and making them go drink water, which I make sure I do now with all my students when we're on site. Go drink water. Making sure everybody's hydrated and making sure that she takes care of them. And because she took care of them, they did everything she asked for. And with that, she made every single design decision that has to do with the renovation of this part. That, to me, translates to design. The woman was a designer, right? But then what do you do to deserve to be a designer, right? You go into training, you think about imagining something new, but then how do you design for a shared future? How do you design for a shared future if you don't have the capacity to emotionally involve other people and create kinships for the future to be shared, with people to share that future with? And as architects, that's sure as hell is our job, imagining shared futures. So what does it mean to build then? What would it mean to build if you can sit there and do nothing but make tea? So is that building? What does it mean to build if all your job is to have the last final thatching or the last final painting tasks of the house? However, these tasks have to be done by hand because the Nubian house has to be touched. So what is that building? How important is it to touch a piece of architecture when you're doing it? It depends on how you understand architecture. How do you connect yourself with land? How do you connect yourself with your ancestors? And understanding where's your lineage. So again, when we go into the School of Architecture, our lineage is severed. We come from so many places. Our ancestors are political actors. All of us, our ancestors are sending us here. All of us, our ancestors are political actors, and they all love us, and they are all bringing us here to do something. But we go into the School of Architecture, we sever that lineage, and they present us with a new lineage. You here, I'm sure, have the resources to be radicalized, just like what we're trying to do at Carleton as well. So I'm trying to just like extra radicalize you as we go. But when you go into that canon class, that's a severance of your lineage into another lineage. So you know what? This is your history of architecture. Not really. Your history of architecture is the one that made you, the one that made this space that allowed you to exist, not just you, but all those who loved you and allowed you to exist. So go back and think about your lineage of architecture. Think about your immigrant parents who came in here and produced a space of comfort within the bounds of concrete jungles of North America. Even though the architecture came and presented its violence, they still produce space for you. They are builders, they made space. So if we as architects, or as people within this field, so it is very important, by the way, it is very important for this trade or for this elitist tradition, our trade, to become exclusive. It's very important to make sure that then only a select few are allowed to join our, finest of the finest in the world to be architects, and everybody else is not an architect. But then you guys who made it into this system, if you start questioning that and understanding building and understanding architecture in a different term, what kind of practice would you want to do? What kind of architecture that works for you and your people and presents you the world and life that you want to live? So within my work, I come to three main principles, or not principles, three main provocations within architecture production. One is relationality. And my motto here is fuck empathy. It's only relationality. Within architecture, there was a big movement around empathetic architecture, empathy, inclusion, empathy. These are very problematic, in my opinion. Empathy means you maintain your position of privilege and by choice venture emotionally into somebody else's suffering and venture back when you're done with it. So the difference between empathy and relationality is the same difference between having universal health care and having to have a GoFundMe to get an operation. Relationality is us entangled into each other. It's the conditioning of all of our well-being to all of our well-being. And that's emotional work. How can we then step out of that bubble of empathy that comes with us sheltering ourselves from the larger systemic issue? And it's, excuse my French, a clusterfuck. Think about what is happening in the world right now. Think about herbicide, right? Think about cities being destroyed, lives being destroyed, or even think about cities being built completely for capital acquisition. And you have to leave your bubble and start organizing against that. That's a lot of emotional work. Unfortunately, it is, but unfortunately, we've got to do it. Otherwise, nothing is going to change. The other one is agency. Architecture, our field, have been guilty of subject production. We produce people as our subject, our clients, our research subjects, our land we produce as a subject, the more than human neighbors we produce as a subject, and everything is revolving around us. If we think about agency of all neighbors, if we think about agency of our land, if we think about agency of the squirrels that are running around us, if we think about agency of our communities, because now we are relational. We started with relationality. We are like, these are not the people I am working for. These are my people. My life is entangled with them. I am working for this architectural project with the people, not just for the people and leaving after, with the community, not for that community. I'm not engaged, I'm entangled. Now, the next step, what is the agency of that community? How can they push back against me and my practice and all my technical tradition that is also rooted in colonial tradition? But also, what is the agency of what is the agency of land? So in indigenous epistemology, epistemologies all around the world, land has personhood. Actually, land has peoplehood, not just personhood. If you start thinking of land as this personhood that takes care of you and allows you to step on it, what agency does that mean? How does it change your practice when you stop thinking about land as a subject you're going to deal with and start thinking about your land as a partner that took care of you, and now you have to take care of this land? The third one, and I think it's the most insidious one, in current architectural scholarship is care. Care is the buzzword in architecture now. There are 1,700 conferences on care. Care exhibitions, care this, care that, the city of care, which I think is in one side started from feminist traditions that really come out of labor, especially domestic labor, that really come out of the grassroots and come out of communities, come out of grassroots communities, and ended up in the upper echelons of art production to think about care and to have all these exhibitions, all these funds that going through care, but while diluting it. It becomes a poetic, symbolic gesture instead of actual work. As somebody who has been going through this exercise for the past few years, care work is back-breaking work. As an architect, it's actually your job, because we signed up for it. So if you are going to think about architecture as care work, and you are not tired collecting stories to make sure they are remembered, if you are not tired working and digging and helping people, if you're not tired repairing a decay that has been allowed to exist so that people can be evicted through the insidious laws of demoviction, if you're not tired, you're not really doing care work. So care is so important. It's probably the most important one. And it also is the one that is most extracted now, or the most, how do I say it? The care now has been the most diluted by neoliberal systems into an anemic stage. And it's our job as critical thinkers to make sure that care remains outside of this anemic perception, understanding that care work is back-breaking work. And I don't mean back-breaking as in hurt yourself, care for yourself, but care work is hard work. It is not performative. Care work is constitutional work, not just symbolic work. So, I take these three principles and I rely on I rely on Black study and Black knowledge and the concept of rehearsal. The concept of rehearsal is a very important concept that rose within Black study in the past decade. This idea of rehearsal, life in rehearsal, doing things instead of trying to manage or govern or extract or control, just rehearse, and life becomes this continued rehearsal. So what rehearsal will look like if I try to take these principles, or not even principles, take these notions that I have put for myself and I have figured out, and see what practice looks like. And that takes us to the Action Lab. The Action Lab is a research center, research community or collective at Carleton. It's me and my students. It has the stupidest name ever, and we chose it intentionally. It's so weird, like, hey, Action Lab, ugh. And we named it this way as a joke. We named it in 5 seconds, and then it took 3 minutes to make the logo. And we did this in this way so that we would never fall victims to our own mythology. Never think that this is something like, oh, we're saving the world. Nope, it's a trial, it's rehearsal, right? So everybody names all these like Carleton Center of Urban Innovation. Nope, we're gonna go to the Action Lab. Why? Because we're activists. Simple, straightforward, very stupid, and we know it. But we are very proud of the position we take as abolitionists. And abolitionists, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, tell us something very important. They tell us that freedom is a place. And you know whose business is placemaking? Us, right? So if freedom is a place, how can we rehearse making that? And we take these trials into small to medium to whatever we can get our hands on projects within the Action Lab and start from the point of service. And service comes from the project of Yonder Commons, Fred Moten and Stefano Harni's concept of debt. Stefano Harni and Fred Moten teach us that for us to live together, we don't need to seek credit. What we need to seek is debt, the debt we have to each other. What do we owe each other? So the Action Lab starts in 2021. It wasn't even called the Action Lab. It was just our first design build, making this community pantry for the Ottawa community, for an activist group around Ottawa community housing in Centertown, Ottawa. Centertown, Ottawa is this very interesting place that represents Centertowns or downtowns in so many North American cities. You find a $2 million townhouse right in front of a community housing tower, or yoga moms doing yoga in the park, and unhoused people sitting on the benches right across from them in the park. These confrontation lines makes it that there's a stark inequality in there. And this Centertown, even though it contains the most amount of restaurants and grocery stores in Ottawa, was declared a food desert. So unless you have your credit card and your cultural capital, you're dressed in a certain way, you don't really have access to food. So food banks and food security activists are really doing a lot of work in that space. And there are a bunch of community pantries that are basically a window into a ground floor in a community health center, or a small kind of wardrobe in the street, like a cupboard in the street, and as pantries look like. So we spoke about pantries, and we spoke about communities of solidarity and what it means to need to get food, and what price do you have to pay to go eat. And within these systems of great precarity, the price people pay to go get food from a food bank is their dignity. You have to shed your dignity, go knock on a door, ask an employee to give you food. We decided that this is unacceptable. What we need to do is a space of dignity. We're going to make, the joke was always that it's going to be a Cadillac. We're going to make the Cadillac of food pantries. It's going to be designed very well to preserve food during the winter. It's going to be well insulated. It's going to have a nice, one of these nice fancy fridges. It's going to be a space that people can sit underneath and not have to stand in the rain, so that they can get a loaf of bread or can get some food. And it's going to be something people are proud of. And the community, the unhoused community in Ottawa, some representatives from the Ottawa Community Housing and the volunteers from the food security groups within Centertown, all were part of the design of this. What are we doing? What are we designing? And then we ended up doing this supposedly very low cost. It was supposed to be very low cost, but we ended up having funding, applying for funding, and we ended up getting a lot of support and help from a lot of community members in Ottawa. A lot of our architectural offices donated materials. A lot of architectural offices donated auditing services for the structure. We had a lot of support to this. And eventually, Public Foods, your community fridge and pantry, is there. Public Foods has been there for 3 years. It has 0 graffiti on it. It has 0 destruction. Nobody had tried to do anything. The only time something happened there, it was somebody who was struggling with addiction tried to go in through that. Like we had to go and fix it. There was kind of a small space between this door and the fridge, and somebody went in there and slept in there, and they had something, a cigarette or something, and there was a small burn. But we luckily have all our material in there to hopefully not be flammable, so nothing happened. But more than that, the community takes care of this very well, and it's very well used. The thing about this is that we are actually the tip, like we are the fingernail of this process. This process is a huge network of activists moving food and bringing resources and lobbying to get food into this and into this pantry every week. They go to the supermarkets every week and they get their stocks. They make arrangements with them. They go and sweet talk somebody to get an extra box of cans. They go and make sure that the food bank in Ottawa does not forget to give them their share. And every day they stock it. So what we offered is a space of dignity. But actually the process, the spatiality itself, relies on that network of care and solidarity that is there. So as architects, we sometimes feel like we're going to do something, we're going to build something and we're going to save the world. We are at the tip of that. We are at the end of that process. And it's actually our job to involve ourselves in the process a little bit more, to embed ourselves in these networks, to know exactly what is needed, what kind of architecture are we trying to produce. And with public foods, what we wanted to produce was the architecture of the good life. Especially because most of us work in the market, and only those who get our talents are people who can afford it, right? So who deserves you? Who deserves your talents? Who deserves us? This is a decision we make as well. And the decision we make while having to pay rent and pay for our own food and student loans and the array of expenses of living in this very damaging world. So public food had a lot of requests from the community that we did everything we can to meet them, including a mural roof. We don't have because we're not allowed to fly drones in Centertown. We only have like a very narrow shot of it, or very far shot of it. But the people who live in auto community housing around in these towers said, no, do not build something ugly, that when we look down, we see something ugly. And we said, okay, what do you want to see? They said, we want to see strawberries and colors. I'm like, strawberries and colors it is. You're getting that. And we actually painted that within our school. Like the courtyard of our school was just a bunch of metal roofs and a bunch of students just, painting and drawing. And it was a huge effort. The second project we had, so we're 2 years in, this is our third year. We did 2 projects and we're going for 3 and 4 this year. These are the design builds. We also have around half a dozen other research projects going on within the lab, including advocacy projects, including research projects, whatever the community needs from us. If our labor is useful to existing struggles and existing grassroots efforts, we lend a hand. This is the Russell Heights hub. Actually, the youth in the community, this is a predominantly Black community, and that basketball court is so beloved, you have no idea. This was the center of everything for us. Even though the most work actually went into that building over there when we had to open up and create that pergola and the space in between. Let me do it here. This space in between, create this pergola and this access to the space, and open up the community kitchen and actually do work of repair. This year we're doing redesign. Last year we did repairs and we refloored and did a bunch of work in that community kitchen. Maybe this one is better. Yeah, here. So the young men and women, the youth in the community, did not like the name we have. They want us to name it 1700 Spot. This is the Russell Heights community that all the houses there started with 17, within like 1700 something, 17. So they wanted to be 1700 Spot, so we're changing the name. They just told me that last week, so I didn't have time to create new slides. But what we have there is this community, the right to the public space kind of community that is coupled with a very important community kitchen or a community. It's not even just a community kitchen. This is after repair. We had the popcorn ceiling. I will not be able to raise my hand that high again after we did all the popcorn ceiling. Again, care work is backbreaking work. And we have this kind of community garden strip that we have this irrigation system that takes in water from the gutters into it. And then there is like an underlay of water that goes around, and the pergola. And this year, we also are giving them an outdoor gym and an outdoor cinema, like outdoor movie space. This is what they want. So that's what we're doing. This community is a predominantly Black community. Our community workshops were translated between English, French, and Swahili. And now in the lab, we have a running joke that everything sounds better in Swahili. So with this one, we go in from just thinking about architecture as a body to thinking about spaces. And we knew that when we are going to deal with this project, we're not going to have a fancy piece of architecture that's going to photograph well and then end up in a competition and we're not going to have what are they called? I forgot. But anyways, we're not going to have that body of art that we're going to need. But what we're going to have is a connection between the space where young women are and the outside space that has been dominated by men. Mothers can sit outside now and mediate in between. We have added a volleyball and a court in the middle between the basketball courts to make sure that the space is not just male-dominated. These young Black women also are a part of this space. We made sure that we remove the severance between the inside and the outside by creating this kind of community pergola that people, it becomes an intermediate space. But also, we want to create a space that demystifies aggression and all the stereotypes that come with Black youth in Ottawa. These are all African immigrants who were born there. These are Canadians. They don't know anywhere else but there. However, they still have still have to deal with the North American unfortunate reality of schools to prison pipeline. They are still thought of as criminal. Even in Ottawa, we have our own George Floyd similar story of police killing a mentally ill young Black man in 2021. The violence on Black bodies continues on this continent anyways, and us living in this land that relies on property, producing land as property, we should not ever forget that also Black bodies were brought here to be property. So the minute we become a part of the property owning class, it becomes a problem in the equilibrium when we find that violence enacted on them. So the project had to deal with that in many forms. For example, we cannot use caution tape. Caution tape is trauma-inducing. It's going to remind them, because the police is there all the time. There are cameras everywhere. Caution tape is what the police does when there is a crime scene. So we delineated our site using pink polka dot tape. It was super cool. I don't have a picture of that here, but now we're using pink polka dot everywhere. We cannot use blue tarp. We cannot use all these carceral visual languages in architecture. We have to be very aware of it when we're dealing with this, because now they are our people. These kids are our kids. And when they mess up, I yell at them and I threaten them and I tell their mothers, and they stop. Oh yeah, true. I look like a headless chicken on site yelling at like 16-year-old kids running around with a basketball on my paint. So yeah, I do threaten to tell their mothers. The lab relies on incredible work of my allies and comrades who are our students of architecture. A lot of our students, I have around 12 students on my payroll in the lab, but we have at least 25 to 30 students volunteering every year. So every year, this is our second year, third year, this is our third year. Every year we have our students coming in and building for the community, joining the design efforts, doing something out of the belief that this is our job. It's our damn job. Also, our colleagues and professors would come in during the summer and paint with us. It becomes a community, it becomes a very horizontal effort. Everybody is doing something without any power imbalances there. It's all about the target and about the aim. And the aim here is to deliver and serve our communities. So, what kind of architects I raised this again to remind you that I know that we need to pay rent, but I also remind you that in this country there are only 12 schools of architecture. You are precious cargo. Your labor is your responsibility. You can situate yourself and decide where your labor goes. And I know you have to pay rent, and I know how the market is. But I ask you to ask yourself, what kind of architect do you want to be? I'm going to conclude at this map of feminist architecture work produced by Charlotte Maltepe for Archie Plus, a magazine, a German architect, a huge German architecture magazine, mapping the grassroots and the feminist traditions in architecture and laying out what other practices and what other positions we can take here. Transforming our pedagogies, foregrounding intersectional justice, decolonizing our spaces, queering our spaces, advocating for institutional change, and many, many more. Thank you very much for listening.